Today we're going to be going over sculptures with basic do's and don'ts and things that have helped me whenever I go to make one myself. I will be using my Warden time-lapse video as an example. If you want to watch that video when you're done here, the link will be in the description below. And the first thing we'll talk about is posturing. Now, this is not something that everyone has to do, but I have found that it really helps those who are not familiar with sculpting or have a harder time visualizing what their end goal should be. Now, as you watch here, I'm using the Oricon Tech engine to set up a body model, so that way I can get the posture down before I start actually building the sculpture. This is a great way to avoid room limits or room bounds or red zones preemptively, rather than decorating for hours and hours and then discovering that you can't build the leg how you'd want it because it's going to hit a red zone. And if you already have a model postured out how you'd like it, it removes a lot of the guesswork on angling later. Here are some examples of how I have used models for posturing in the past. Posturing is also key for making a sculpture look not garbage, in that you'll see a lot of sculptures that will be T-posing, kind of to a degree. They don't have pose, they don't have any natural movement in them, it's just a rigid doll, and this really helps resolve that problem. Also be certain to take into account the scale at which you are working. For example, the Armored Titan sculpture is kind of huge compared to a Warframe, so you also need to give a really good look at the decorations you're going to be using and see which ones can even scale to the size that you need for the detail that you're wanting. Also really give a good look through the decorations list to see what all can work for what you're trying to make. It is really easy and tempting to just use one single decoration to do all the detail, especially if it has a relatively uniform texture, but try to use a variety of different things. For example, I used asteroid rocks for Oryx here, but I tried to hybridize it with infested. Just go out of your way to make it so it's not so bland. Sometimes there are cases where you can't avoid that though, especially depending on your reference material, and I get that. Something to keep in mind here is that nothing is going to work out exactly how you've planned it. If you go and actually watch the time-lapse video for the Warden, you'll see that I change about 1 trillion things, and I essentially don't stop changing. Now, maybe there is someone out there that is just bloody perfect and they do everything correct the first try and they don't have to change a single thing. But keep in mind that it's okay to change it, it is okay to keep changing it, and odds are you will have to keep changing it as you go. Be sure that you factor capacity costs into your room planning when you are trying to feel out a room and what you want to do in there, because the Warden is actually my least expensive sculpt. The Warden was around 220-ish pieces. Meanwhile, the Armored Titan sculpt was around 680. Oryx sculpture was around the same. The Winter Shogun was somewhere around 280, I want to say. Sculptures that are well done and detailed are not cheap on capacity. They will drain the absolute shit out of your room. Now, I'm not saying that all sculptures have to be incredibly large or detailed in order to be good, but small sculptures that are not detailed often suck. I think the funniest thing I ever see is when people put like a stick figure-esque kind of deal, and then they put a tribita upside down on the top and think that'll work for a head. It just looks atrocious. I have found it best to start with the chest first, on whatever you're sculpting. Obviously, this can vary depending on your project. It's kind of hard to give you guidelines over something that is so variable like this, but starting with the chest gives you a good reference for the proportions for everything else. If you want to play it super safe, you can start with the head, so that way if you're uncertain if you're going to have objects small enough to make facial features or whatever you're doing with that, you can start with the head first and then scale the body according to the head afterwards. Next, it is best to do the thighs and then the shoulders and upper arms. This will give you a good reference point as to how big or small the ass and back should be, depending on how you're sculpting. Once you have finished the backside, you can go ahead and move on to the lower arms and the lower legs, the forearms, whatnot. If you end up doing claws, or like paws or whatever you're doing, that should be relatively easy. If you're doing hands, that's going to be a bit more difficult. Common things for fingers that I see are corpus barrels, the tenno lights, or the coral stack single. Now moving on to heads. Heads are tricky bastards, and I know I made fun of people that used tributas for heads earlier, but I understand why they do it. It's a one and done, relatively textured thing that they can just plop on and call it good. Do I think it looks remotely good? No. Do I think it can work for a head? Yes. Earlier I said it is safest to start with the head, and the reason for that is the head often has the smallest details. So if you are able to do the head at the scale that you'd like, then you are able to do the rest of the body without concern as well. I don't have any specific super helpful tips to tell you here other than to take into account that the details on the head are often going to be smaller. You would hate to get to the end of your sculpt, which is the head maybe in this case, and find out that you can't finish it because you can't even make the head how you'd like. I know all of this may not be as direct and concise as my decoration basics video might be, because there aren't specific functions to teach you. There aren't set rules for sculpting. The best I can do is show you the guidelines that I follow when I make one, and then hope that you are able to apply it to whatever you decide to make as well. I thought about listing some super commonly used decorations in a variety of different sculpts, but I figured that sculpting is so open-ended you can use a single rock 1,000 times to make an incredibly detailed dragon. So me showing you what is commonly used isn't really going to help much, considering you can do literally whatever the hell you want with it. I'd been asked for some tips on sculpting, and hopefully for those of you who were asking, this has given you what you were after. If it did not, and you were hoping for a step-by-step guide on making a specific sculpture, then please watch my time-lapse videos as I make them, and that will do you just fine.